Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to begin with this webinar. So it's the first one of, I hope it will be a series of webinar about the relation between arts, literature, and politics in Central Asia from the 1950s until nowadays. So the idea is was to put together different researchers who are working on this huge subject, which are art and literatures in Central Asia, and to try to have kind of new views about the different processes who were on in Central Asia and who are maybe not all put together, because we are a lot of people who are working on different subjects. It could be art from the contemporary art, it could be literature and different music, and they don't always get together. And the idea is to have a more huge figure about what was happening in Central Asia, and especially with the different political regime and political ideology from the Soviet period and after with the independence since 1991. And so what the idea here, we will have a lot of different presentation on all the 5 countries of the post-Soviet Central Asia. Anyway, I hope so. For the moment, we will have 3 sessions today in April, in May and June. So today it's about literature, in a sense, in Central Asia. And in May, it will be a presentation by Lucy Lisak on contemporary music in Uzbekistan. And in June, a presentation by Saida Lemanova on Kazakh music and from the Soviet period until nowadays. And more specifically on about what we can talk about, say, like traditional Kazakh music. And we will have to continue this webinar from September with a monthly session, and we will try to go on about this subject. So if you are interested in to know more about the idea of this webinar, you could find it on the site of IFEAC, and there is a more detailed presentation about this webinar. Today, I'm very happy to introduce you with Alexei Ul'ko for a presentation entitled "Enlightened Despots or 3 Central Asian Writers." Alexei Ul'ko is currently working at the British Council in Tachkent, and for 20 years, he has been exploring the relation between cultures and languages, and those between culture and arts. And he has been writing about contemporary Central Asian art and culture for different art journals and online publications. Being an art critic, he was also a curator for several exhibitions in Central Asia and Russia. One of his last projects is the international collaborative project Art Plof Central Asia from 2020 to 2021, which finished this year, and received 1 month ago an award for the year's exhibition by the art newspaper Russia for an exhibition on esoteric art, which is called We Preserve Our White Dreams. And his today's talk, it will go through a few decades of history from the 1950s in Soviet Uzbekistan until the 21st century in the independent Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And I'm very happy because I think the idea of this webinar is well represented in this first presentation, which linked really well literature and politics through a kind of not long history, but anyway, from the 50s until nowadays. So it's quite in the idea of what I wanted to do with this webinar. So I'm very happy now we can listen to Alexei Ul'ko. And then afterwards, we could have a session for questions and commentaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xavier, and it's really a pleasure to take part in this webinar and to actually to be the first speaker on the webinar, and it's a great honor. Thank you very much for inviting me. I would like really to share some of the thoughts I've had over these years about some aspects, some relationship between the power and literature in Uzbekistan and in Central Asia in general, because I can see there are some patterns which may not be sufficiently explored in the way I would like them to be explored. And then I sort of decided to step in and see whether it can lead to any interesting conclusions about the nature of power, the nature of the discourse in Central Asia, and in particular in Uzbekistan. And I will just go straight into the presentation of my talk. So let me just switch on that thing. And yes, I've just decided to put together three thoughts, three ideas about different writers from Central Asia, different rulers. And although I will speak probably more about Sharaf Rashidov because I have explored that in more detail, but I think that other two examples are also quite telling and interesting from different viewpoints. So we have this concept of enlightened despot, which of course is sort of borrowed from the European tradition, and then I would like to see and to follow how that tradition can be applied to Central Asia and whether it actually works in Central Asia. So yeah, my name is Alexei Ul'ko, and I'm currently based in Tachkent, although I'm originally from Samarkand, and that's important. So in this talk, I'll have, first of all, a brief introduction into the concept of the enlightened despot in the Soviet Union and Central Asia, so how it worked. So what were some of the key components of that? And then I will just discuss Sharaf Rashidov, who was the first secretary of the Communist Party of Uzbekistan, and for many years, from 1959 to 1983. But I will not focus on what he did at that time, or even what he wrote at that time. I will focus on a very particular piece, which is called the Song of Kashmir. And I will tell you more about why, the reason why I sort of decided to focus on that, and what sort of interesting ramifications it has for the history of colonialism in Central Asia and different aspects of Soviet power in Central Asia as well. Then I will talk about his successor, in a way, Islam Karimov, the first president of the independent Uzbekistan, who also stayed in power for many years. But then I'll talk about his writings, and in the sense, we'll see whether he's got anything in common with such interestingly different figures as Lenin and Tamerlane. And then I will finish with looking at Sapar Murat Niâzov, the Turkmenbashi, and his Ruhnama, which are relatively better explored, and there is more literature on those. Although, again, I would say that sometimes not in the way I would like them to be. So the analysis which is available is slightly different to what I would like it to be from time to time, because, well, it focuses very much on the political side and the history, but not so much on the literary side of the text. And then I'll ask a question, and probably that will open up an opportunity for further discussion of whether it is all these writings and the concept of enlightened despot is kind of over, and whether this authoritarian modernity is again has come to a certain end or not. So let's just look at the enlightened despots of Central Asia. Of course, there are so many of those, and if you just Google enlightened despot contemporary, you will find there are so many figures, so many people all over the world writing something. So I decided to focus just on these three. And the key thing, which I think is very important for the whole discourse, is well, there are several books on that issue, and one of those is about despots in Central Asia. And one of the key questions related to this concept is the difference between the ruler who is in power and the ruler who's got to be in power. And there's a certain difference, discursive difference, between the fact of possessing power by different legitimate means or illegitimate means. And then there's also need to convince the subjects, convince the population that the same person has to remain in power. And that sort of narrative, this message of projecting some kind of necessity, some kind of benefits, and sometimes a legitimacy is very interesting issue. And such people as, well, Weber and Fabian Peter and John Martin van der Molen, they looked into this aspect and discovered several interesting things. So, of course, one of the key things is that this tradition of divine power is not new, obviously, and it goes back to the Divus Augustus, and it always involves some kind of reverse myth-making. In this sense, I mean that the holder of that power tends to reinterpret themselves, well, usually himself, of course, rather than herself, in a kind of in a way that will suit that purpose of legitimating their hold on power. So there is always a myth making, there is always reinvention of personal biography. And if you read about Augustus, then you will find very interesting details about his divine origins, and going as far as to Immaculate Conception. But that also happens with the recent rulers in Central Asia. You have this some kind of obscure biographies. You've got those strange silence or strange sort of ambiguity about all those people's youth and even origins, and which, of course, give rise to lots of different speculations about their parents, their families. And that sort of immaculate conception sort of lingers somewhere in the background, so that the ruler appears on the front scene as a kind of a fully fledged personality, which you just take, but then the origins of the ruler are kind of different, and they they tend to be, when I say obscure, I mean there's a obscurity of the real facts, but then certain aspects of their family life, their origins are highlighted, and in particular in the sense, in the case of Turkmenbashi, and they serve as cornerstones of their personal myth, but that we'll also look into a bit later. So there is also that kind of, I would say, separate, me it's a separate thing, like this prophetic and messianic symbolism of Abrahamic religions, with that sort of archetype of the book, which carries some kind of truth, and the creator of that book, or who either kind of generates that truth, or very often sort of carries on certain truth. So you have an interesting ambition here, and of course, in the case of Rashidov, Karimov, and Niâzov, who were all kind of Soviet, basically apparatchiks, this religious symbolism is not as strongly pronounced as in many other cases, which are known internationally. But I think that this messianic symbolism is very important for all these three categories of people. And but then it is just a part of the whole thing. It's a part of a very interesting symbiosis, hybrid, because there is also that thing, which I would say communist historical determinism and Marxist teleology. Because if you remember Marxism, the orthodox Marxism, which is very clear on the succession of what they call social and economic formations. So, and then there was a debate about the role of personality in history, and the role of personality is to carry out certain predestined steps, but of course predestined in the sense of, not religious sense, but in the sense of historical materialism, so that there's a certain succession of the society which have to replace one another. And then obviously there are some people who are empowered to carry that out. And I think that this historical determinism of Marxist ideology is very much present in the personalities of these people, of the Central Asian rulers, but also in their writings. So that sort of lingering influence of communism mixed up with, you know, some kind of things which I have already mentioned, and then also with this self-determination, because in the end, as Kashorky and Kaminsky write in their work on the despots and tyranny and poetry, they say that in the modernism ideologies, literature represents an especially suitable laboratory, which I like this word, laboratory, particularly since it has served as a breeding ground for the epoch's most powerful ideological force, nationalism. So this connection between literature and nationalism, of course, is not news, something well explored, and in the context of Europe, 19th century, how literature, in particular poetry, was linked to this rise of the national identity, which was reconsidered in many ways by the writers and poets who were seen as kind of the agents and the creators of those processes. But then it's very interesting that, of course, nation building in Central Asia is a long process which started long before the independence, and how it went on during the Soviet years and how it culminated in the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, is beyond my discussion today. But I think we should keep in mind that sort of interesting duality, because all these nations, of course, came about in the 1920s as a result of national delimitation with the creation of the USSR. But then again, interestingly, they kind of retained their integrity, but then were seen as liberated, and those in particular Turkmenbashi and Karimov were seen and presented themselves as the liberators of their nations from the Soviet yoke. But that is something which I would like you to remember, and maybe we will be coming back to these notions while I'll be talking about these characters and their writings, their texts. So just to remind you who I'm going to talk about is Sharaf Rashidov, the first secretary of the Uzbek Communist Party from 1959. But the text I'm going to discuss was written in 1956. Well, he was not yet the first secretary of the Uzbek Communist Party, and so didn't have that kind of authority. But then he played a different role, as he was the, I think, the secretary of the Writers' Union of Uzbekistan. He was the deputy of the first secretary of the Supreme Presidium of the USSR. So he was quite an important figure, but not yet the key person in Uzbekistan. And on the other hand, Islam Karimov, the president of Uzbekistan, the first president, who served for many years, basically for what, 24, 25 years. And he was very much a key figure in Uzbekistan. And his writings also deserve some attention, although they're quite different to those of Rashidov's. Then, of course, Murat Niâzov, the Turkmenbashi, who was widely seen as a kind of a rather eccentric figure, but nevertheless very interesting. And with his eccentricity, I think, comes an important dimension, which I call uninhibited imagination. And that we'll touch upon when I'll come to them. So this work I'm going to talk about is the Song of Kashmir. And the reason I can talk about that was that several years ago, a friend of mine, a publisher living in Britain, in London, approached me and said, "Alex, why don't you translate the Song of Kashmir into English? And then we'll have it published in London." And basically, it was linked to the 100th anniversary of Rashidov. So I said, why not? But let me also kind of write a sort of an essay about him. So then kind of introduction to his poetic text. So apart from making this translation, I was also going to write a kind of literary analysis of that. And well, several people helped me, as I was not alone translating that. So a lot of work was done by my friend in Samarkand, Dmitry Kostyushkin, and then there is a lot of work done by the editor of the text. But here we go, we've got that translation. And but before that, I would like to say a couple of words about the fact that Rashidov, of course, when he wrote that text, he had been already a journalist and a writer. And of these three rulers, he was the only one who was the writer before he came to power. He started writing when he was still in the army in the Second World War, but then continued writing articles as a journalist. And then, so by the time he wrote that, the Song of Kashmir, he had been already quite an established figure. And basically in the Uzbek literature scene. And when you read about Rashidov, you think like, okay, what was his path? What did he do before that and after that? You can see that well, there's something written about him in encyclopedias, and that would be a typical entry saying that his first collection of poems called My Anger was published in 1945. So he started as a poet and a journalist. Then he wrote a novella, The Victors, in 1951, which depicts the people's labors to cultivate new arable lands. So a fairly typical Soviet plot. The heroes also has been borrowed by him from his early novel into his later novel, which is called The Stronger Than a Tempest, the novel Mighty Wave, the heroism of the Soviet people during the Second World War. And of course, about his later works, one can say that there's a lot of rumors about that. Of course, he was not the writer, the actual author of those texts, that he was basically supervising a team of literary slaves, which of course pertains to all three characters. But those rumors have now been substantiated, so nobody sort of actually came out and said, okay, I've written a text for Rashidov, so I'm the author, the legitimate one. So I'm not going to discuss that at length. What I was interested to see was that the romantic novella, The Song of Kashmir, 1956, reflects the Indian people's struggle for liberation. And you think, well, that's an interesting thing to say, because you would expect that, okay, there is a heavy focus on this struggle, so there's going to be a novel about some kind of anti-colonial fight. But then at the end of the day, you just find that the legend of the Song of Kashmir is based on a traditional Kashmiri legend. That's what the encyclopedias say. And there is a kind of a narrative, which is a fairy tale narrative about the king of bees falling in love with a beautiful daffodil, the narcissus, and you know, that sort of story of love, which takes place in the fertile Kashmir Valley. And then you have trees, you have bees, you have different flowers, and then there is of course a conflict between those flowers and some kind of forces of nature, like the sun with its dry heat, and then this blizzard and snow, so on. So you have that sort of classical dualistic story of love, which sort of asserts itself in spite of and in the struggle against some kind of evil forces. But then, okay, almost every story about every fairy tale has that sort of component of, you know, dualistic and binary forces fighting against one another. And the fact that it is based on the cyclical change of seasons is also quite interesting, and the yearly triumph of the forces of life over the forces of death. Then, of course, in decay makes it kind of very essentialistic, but then the question, of course, remains, why is this anti-colonial? Why does it represent Indian people's struggle for liberation? Because you've got those fairy tales, but it would be a very far-fetched, should I say, hypothesis to bring any kind of binary story as a symbol or kind of a reflection of anti-colonial struggle. This anti-colonial struggle of the Indian people, of course, is something which has its own shape, it has its history, but then you can't really read that in the text, which is, to me, was a kind of a very traditional fairy tale with lots of, sort of pompous vocabulary and flowery depictions of love and so on. So I was kind of puzzled by that, because I was trying to search for more cues, trying to look for something which could give me kind of a better understanding of that, which I could see on the surface. And then if you read that, the first and the secondary edition, you find that Rashidov himself writes in the introduction to the second edition that he confirms that fact, that it is related to the Indian struggle for independence against imperial forces, doesn't explain why. And then within the text itself, there is also a kind of an introduction within the text when a wise man says that I'm going to tell you a story. I think he talks to a kind of a disciple of some kind. So there's a Sufi sort of master who talks to his disciple and says, well, I'm going to tell you a story which has a hidden meaning. So the person who doesn't understand that will not get that, but there is one, this hidden meaning. So this clue of a story within a story with the clef, to me was not very forthcoming, because the story looked fairly straightforward to me, and I had to start sort of digging into what was going on. And what I found is that, first of all, the origin of the story, the Kashmiri legend, was not exactly based basically on the Kashmiri legend itself. And I had to go into the history of Kashmir, Jammu Kashmir of the time, and found that it had an interesting, very kind of curious history behind it. So that is something which I have discovered myself. Of course, this research lacks many details, which probably would be interesting to fill in, but then what happens is as follows. So, and at that time, in sort of early 50s, in the early 50s, after the partition of Imperial India, Kashmir was still kind of an independent state, and its head was Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah, apparently a very interesting character, kind of who was seen as a kind of progressive Muslim person. And then, of course, the whole thing was happening at the time when Jawaharlal Nehru was trying to solve the problem of Kashmir. So the problem of Kashmir was, of course, that British colonial rule ended in 1947, rather hastily, and the delimitation between the Muslim and the Indian parts was not done in the most prudent way. So, and Jammu and Kashmir was an independent state with the Muslim majority. So about 77% of the population were Muslims. And there was a Kashmir War in 1947 because there were different groups or tribes of people who belonged to different faiths, and they created some kind of chaos, and so there was a lot of trouble on that ground. And Lord Mountbatten, for example, wanted Kashmir to join India, and Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah sort of agreed to that. He, at that time, seemed to be kind of happy to do that, and basically Kashmir joined India. But then in 19 and Sheikh Abdullah became the first prime minister of Kashmir. But then followed another thing which is called the Kashmir conspiracy case, when Indian defense, Indian intelligence discovered that Sheikh Abdullah was scheming against the rule of India, and he was connected with Pakistan, and his apparent desire was to secede from India and then to proclaim an independent Kashmir. So that was kind of the context which in which the Song of Kashmir was created, because of course in 1953 also Stalin died, and that brought about a kind of a significant change in the policies of the Soviet Union, because Stalin famously didn't like Nehru at all. He didn't want to deal with him at all, but his successors decided that they were really interested in, in kind of bringing in, establishing some kind of relationship between the Soviet Union and other countries, especially from the non-alignment movement, and with kind of neutral democracies like India. Then, so Jammu and Kashmir ascended to India, joined India in 1954 fully, but the Kashmir conspiracy case sort of happened a year later. Then Sheikh Abdullah was removed from power, and he was put into jail for this schemes. And apparently Nehru was shocked to see that his friend Abdullah betrayed him, and he was very disappointed with that. So at that time, so the big delegation was assembled to visit India and to render support to Nehru, to his vision of India, which was seen as progressive, and of course opposing the involvement of Americans. So the Soviet delegation was formed and sent to India, and that delegation included Rashidov, still kind of rather young, but a prominent member of the delegation. And when they came to India, they also visited Kashmir and attended the production of the opera written by the Kashmiri poet Dinanath Nadim. So and that opera, of course, was the source of inspiration for Rashidov's writing. So Soviet interest in Indian non-alignment movement was great, and of course, Kashmir was seen as an important part, the important element of Indian struggle against imperialists, against America and Pakistan. So the Soviet delegation supported Nehru, visited them in 1955, and then they went to see this opera, which was called Bambur Tayamberzal by Dinanath Nadim, which was the text, the text which he wrote based on Kashmir legend. So Dinanath Nadim was an interesting character in himself. So he was a member of the so-called Cultural Conference, which was a left-wing group of Kashmiri writers and intellectuals. Dinanath Nadim visited China several years before that, and he was particularly impressed by the opera called White-Haired Girl, which he saw in Beijing. And the White-Haired Girl was one of the 8 established operas, which depict kind of a complex story of national liberation and love. So there are some parallel plot lines, the struggle of the Chinese against the Japanese, and then also the struggle of one character against his landlord, and struggle for love, basically. So Dinanath Nadim was inspired by that, and he decided to do the same for Kashmir. So he came back and looked for a proper legend, Kashmiri legend, to rework and to base his new text on. So he found that this Bambur and Yamberzal sounds like a good idea to rework. So he reworked that in a very strong manner. And then the Soviet delegation saw its second production. The opera Bamburta Yamberzal was the first opera in the Kashmir language that was seen as an important symbol of that Kashmiri self-awareness, but also an important gesture of solidarity with the left-wing movement. And that, of course, happened in the context of Warsaw Pact, because obviously Warsaw Pact was also concluded in 1955. So the idea was to give a kind of to make a gesture which would support the Kashmiri allegiance, Kashmiri kind of integrity and unity with India, and to grant them a sign of support from the Soviet Union. So what happened is that, as I said, Dinanat Nadim reworked a Kashmiri fairy tale in the style of White-Haired Girl, the Chinese opera. He changed the plot of that fairy tale. The fairy tale was rather pessimistic. So the king of bees goes blind in search of his love. But then Dinanat Nadim decided to make it optimistic. And he made in the opera, which he kind of composed, he wrote a libretto for, and then composed that, was of course had a very strong visual component. So the people who write about that opera, they underline the fact that it had some characters who obviously reminded them of the Kashmir conspiracy case. So that element of anti-colonial struggle was not so much in the text itself, and not in the fairy tale, but rather in the production of the opera. So the viewers could refer to that, they could recognize some kind of resemblance and some sort of references made in this opera to the current political case, to the Kashmir conspiracy case. So that was obvious to the viewers of that opera in the Kashmir language, who were, of course, very familiar with what was going on in Kashmir at the time. So, as I said, the Soviet authorities decided to support that kind of pro-India and anti-US, anti-Pakistani sentiment, and decided to kind of position this Song of Kashmir, which Rashidov probably was instructed to translate into Uzbek and Russian, or to write kind of a text which would kind of reflect that sort of would reflect the same idea, and would give support by the Soviet Union to the Kashmir case. So they wanted to straight away, they wanted this gesture to be interpreted as the support of the Soviet Union of the Indian people's struggle for liberation. So it was not just the Kashmiri sort of issue, it was not a local sort of writer staging an opera for his circle of intellectuals. It had to be given a much larger meaning, much more significant sort of event in the cultural life of whole India, and an important part of the Indian-Soviet relations. So at the same time, we should remember that Uzbekistan already had been presented for many years as a kind of a success story of a Muslim republic inhabited by Muslims predominantly, but well integrated into the Soviet Union, so into that left-wing discourse and the Soviet socialist project. So I can only hypothesize what happened, but obviously the decision to translate or to rework Dinanat Nadim's text and libretto into a new piece of work was probably taken on the higher level. So I don't think that it was just purely Rashidov's initiative. So that text was written, and I think that Rashidov wrote it in Uzbek first, then it was translated into Russian. Interesting thing happened later, because it sort of didn't stay just one-off gesture. It gave rise to to a whole series of remakes of different kinds. So in 1965 there was a cartoon based on that, and the second edition of the Kashmir song was published in 1976, where Rashidov added an introduction talking about that hidden meaning. And then you can see interesting kind of references in Salman Rushdie's Shalimar the Clown. So he has got characters called Bambur Yamberzal, who's married to a wife called Harud. So whatever he meant, Salman Rushdie meant by referencing that is not clear, but interestingly, you can see that the Rashidov's text also gave rise to, well, it was a ballet as well, and in Uzbekistan, and then perhaps it also influenced the kind of a loop input, was a kind of reverse influence on the Indian film The Legend of Love, so which was based not so much on the Kashmiri's legend, but on the text by Rashidov. So, but then, of course, with the collapse of the USSR, that whole paradigm, that sort of whole story of supporting Indian struggle for let's say independence and then anti-imperialist struggle came to an end, because now we can ask ourselves the question whether that collapse of the USSR could be seen in this context as a kind of a loss, or on the other hand as a victory in the anti-colonial struggle, because obviously the Soviet Union itself, as we know, positions itself as a kind of anti-colonial and anti-colonial force, so supporting anti-colonial struggle in Asia, but then its collapse also is seen as a kind of a liberation. So that's kind of an ambiguous background is there, and which of course poses a lot of questions about the legacy of such texts of the Kashmir song, which interestingly hasn't stopped at that. And even now we have Dinanath Nadim's texts involved in different forms of controversy. And as you may know, in 2019, the Indian authorities, the Modi government, liquidated and abandoned Article 370, which gave the state of Jammu and Kashmir some independence, some autonomy. So Jammu and Kashmir was kind of joined, so as its status changed as a union state. So it is just one of those administrative units of India. And while talking about that and talking about the new budget of India, several months later, the Indian finance minister read out this Dinanath Nadim's poems about Kashmir, which of course sparked controversy because Dinanath Nadim was seen as not so much as a voice of the unified India, but rather a kind of a left-wing patriot of Kashmir. So that sort of struggle is still going on, but important thing is, of course, that nobody knows about that any longer, and the story of Babur and Yamberzal, of the King of Bees and the Daffodil, of course, has lost its political connotation completely. And with that, I want to go straight to talking about the second character, the second writer. And then in the end, we'll discuss all those differences between the way they position themselves in this literary political paradigm. So Islam Karimov, and just a couple of words about him. So he was born in a Tajik-speaking part of Samarkand. So of course, there are lots of rumors about whether he spoke any Uzbek at all, and he probably did, because I think that I know the area where he was born. And in Samarkand, of course, you've got kind of Tajik-speaking old town, but most people speak several languages, and Tajik may be just one of the first languages for that community, but people do speak Uzbek as well. So again, we have an interesting situation with Karimov, that his origins are a bit unclear. So something which we know about is that he was He graduated an institute as an engineering mechanic, then became an economist. He worked for the state plan. He was a minister of finance after Rashidov's death. And then he was appointed the president of the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, which of course he occupied only for 1 month, because then he declared independence and was the president of Uzbekistan for 27 years. So in other words, he was very far away from any literary heritage, and he was not so much interested in becoming a kind of educated or enlightened despot, writing poetry, a kind of a poet king as Goethe would have it. So his path was very different, but then it's still interesting that it's characterized by by his obscure childhood, and then his educational and professional development. Those things are rather unclear. So there are lots of rumors about whether he got his education legitimately or not, but that's not what is interesting in this particular context. It was, of course, interesting to see that as some writers, Adam Svensson and Urenboev, say that in the early 90s, after Karimov came to power, so they made all sort of claims about the strong commitment to democracy, market economy, human rights, and the rule of law. That was important. And Karimov obviously saw himself as a key messianic figure, changing the life of Uzbekistan from kind of colonial obscurity to a bright future. So there was a lot of optimism at the time, and the approach that Karimov took was kind of based on the Soviet legacy. So he didn't abandon it, but criticized the Soviet Union heavily. But they kind of adopted a kind of gradualist approach to economy, changing the situation from the Soviet socialist system to kind of capitalist market as infrastructure very gradually. But then straight from the beginning, it was seen that the Uzbek infrastructure, the Uzbek system is corrupt, and that it is rendered rather inefficient by the top-down governance. And culturally, Karimov was very ambiguous about Islam, because on the one hand, he actually proclaimed that Islam was a part of national tradition of Uzbeks. In one of those occasions when he was re-elected, he even took an oath on the Quran rather than on the constitution of Uzbekistan. And his idea of the bright future, which is connected to the glorious past, was important. And that kind of primordial vision of history, primordial vision of culture was basically overwhelming. And in Uzbekistan, there was a very important, I think, part of the ideology of Uzbekistan. So he developed what could be called the Uzbek model. And he was the creator of the Uzbek model, which is still kind of being discussed. You can find texts about the Uzbek model even now in some of those journals, which are seen as vanity publications. And there are some writers who write about the Uzbek model and its relevance to the current world. But in general, it was a rather conservative approach, positioned as unique and innovative, as kind of maybe revolutionary, and in many ways, sort of that's what Karimov really wanted himself to be seen. So, and I'm going to talk about his writings, what he did, and his basically his political life represented through these writings in terms of two linguistic concepts. One is metonymy, which is kind of a development of a meaning through association, and then the metaphor. So I think that both tools, both stylistic devices were explored by Karimov in his writing. So if we talk about metonymies, I think that his first metonymically determined sources of his writings were very much writings by Marx, Engels, and Lenin, which are known as primary sources. And the idea of being первоисточник, I think was very particularly attractive to Karimov. Because what he did, he actually wrote, he didn't write too much. So he was not so much a writer, but a speaker. So he spoke, and his speeches were recorded. So he was not a poet king, kind of, to use this term of the Goethe. So he was not interested in fiction and writing fiction, in writing any kind of poetry. So what he did, he spoke about the actual topical problems of today, and basically, obviously, there were speech writers for him, and then his speech writers, of course, worked off his template. So he decided to focus on sort of some key issues in his speeches, but then he amended and articulated those speeches while he was talking. Then they were converted into script and in works. So this term works is very important for Karimov. I think that it's not, so we're here talking not just about articles, right, but about, or speeches, but about works, labors, trudy Karimova. And I think that it's very clear that there was a content template from the Soviet Union. So Karimov himself was educated in the Soviet days, so he used that Marxist dialectic a lot in his texts, kind of maybe simplified, but still it's very visible. And with the only change, a significant change, of course, is that the national ideology, the ideas of nationalism replacing communism in many ways. So the concept of national something, national identity, national mentality, national culture was the key thing in his writing. Is kind of continued to write or to speak in this rather pompous Soviet style. So such terms of further perfection of our national ideology, further perfection of this, further perfection of that, they scattered around his texts and his speeches. And it is very clear that the Soviet influence has been very strong on his writing, although he criticized the Soviet Union a lot in his texts. So, but also you can see that the Soviet influence somehow could be seen in the formal template, because what he wanted them to be, those texts, is to become new primary sources. So they were published in huge number of copies, they had to be studied, and they had to be quoted. So it was obvious on the kind of very superficial level that the slogans with Lenin's quotations from Lenin, were replaced by slogans and quotations from Karimov. Karimov's works were published in a kind of very austere, kind of academic style manner, and they were distributed around libraries across the country. Then there was a new subject which was developed, which was called Manaviat Marifat, which can be translated as spirituality and enlightenment. So enlightenment comes again, this enlightened despot, enlightened people, and enlightenment here meant to be basically to be educated through the vision of Karimov's. So Karimov's works have replaced the primary sources of the fathers of dialectical materialism, and he became himself the primary source of knowledge and wisdom and well, understanding of life and understanding of the political context in Uzbekistan. So just to give you a short kind of picture of that time, when Karimov just came to power, here we can see him and this range of Samarkand. So it is him visiting and hosting Boris Yeltsin in Samarkand with people I know personally, and those were the mayor of Samarkand, the mayor of the governor of the Samarkand province. So Karimov was very much interested in seeing himself as an equal, as a person of worth to be treated with respect. He was treated with respect. He wanted to be seen as the head of a kind of large and important country which had a great future. So his writings had to serve this purpose, to support him in this particular endeavor. As for the metaphors, he used a slightly different approach. So, as I said, that his vision of the great future was very much based on the idea of a glorious past. So the glorious past of Uzbekistan determines the great future, right? So again, we have here this concept of staying in power was one thing, but also that had to be seen as the legitimate reason to be in power and legitimate reason for the people to want him to stay in power. So he was seen as somebody who ought to be in power. His concept of Uzbekistan and the culture of Uzbekistan was heavily borrowed from the Jadid Abdurrauf Fitrat's Chagateism, so the things like the centrality of the Turkic culture in Uzbekistan, the role of a nation, so Karimov was fixated on the nation of the Uzbek nation this time, and of course even the role of Tamerlane was something which was very important. So it was not in the very first years of Karimov's rule when he decided to rely on the legacy of Tamerlane, but a bit later, so closer to the mid-90s. But then Tamerlane was seen as the father of the nation. So the enlightened despot of the East, a statesman with a strong head, and of course the reference was made implicitly that Karimov was as good as Tamerlane. Karimov was also the father of the nation. So there was a lot of cleaning Tamerlane's name from different kinds of lies by the Soviet historians. So that cleaning up operation, I think, was very important for Karimov as well. And then I think that there is also that again, rather implicit, obscure reference to Stalin, although Karimov never made his views on Stalin clear. He obviously was very critical about the period of Stalin, concentration camps and suppression of Uzbek intelligentsia. That was true, but I think that on the personal level, this idea of being the father of the nation was very attractive to Karimov, and that metaphorical reference was also there. And even now, from time to time, you read different texts about Karimov, his significance, and then this one is very interesting. I found it in the text by Leonid Levitin. So the emergence of Islam Karimov at the helm of the country can be compared with the arrival of Winston Churchill to the leadership of Britain in 1940, at a time that was catastrophic for her. So Winston Churchill, again, another controversial character, obviously the great imperialist, but also the great leader, the savior of Britain from the occupation, the formidable figure who was on par with Stalin and Roosevelt, but also was as you know, Nobel Prize laureate for literature. So, and I think that obviously Karimov did not harbor any desire to be seen as a writer, as a writer of fiction. He didn't write much about himself either, but the primary source, so as it's a kind of hybrid of several sources. So my vision here is that there's a cultural and ideological hybridity inspired by those Orientalist metaphors of Tamerlane and Chagateism, the great heritage of the Uzbek people, but also it was based on the Soviet metonymical narratives of the primary sources. So he wanted to combine these two, and to which extent that was a conscious decision and whether it was unconscious is not very clear, but still that is the impression I have. So that the Soviet power, the Soviet paradigm had a great influence on him, and although the content of what he was writing about was rather different. So he's got that core message about Uzbek state, and then he adapted this core message to different kind of contexts. So he wrote texts from 1992 or 94 to 2010. So that's kind of career. And again, we don't really know exactly whether he was himself, to what extent he was involved in writing those texts and speeches himself. So here we have Karimov with Saparmurat Niâzov, who is going to be the third and the last hero of my today's talk. And as I said in the beginning, so I link Niâzov with the concept of uninhibited imagination, whereas Rashidov and Karimov obviously struggled with different kind of restraints and different kinds of limitations imposed on them by the context, by historical sort of different kind of obstacles and circumstances as well. I think that the key to understanding of Niâzov in his writing was that he sort of was uninhibited. He could do whatever he wanted. He wanted to write, he wanted to create, he wanted to position himself in the way he wanted, and there were apparently very few forces that could oppose that. So in here we have an example of myth making at large, basically, myth making which is has become the key state policy. So Garak, who wrote in 2006, right after Niâzov's death, he wrote this phrase that mythologized personality of Turkmenbashi had a stronger impact on the state building processes in modern Turkmenistan than the formal institutions of power, which I would say was a very strong thing to say. It's important because this personality cult was not just kind of sort of an attribute of power in Turkmenistan, but its essential core. Again, we have this much more than in the previous cases. We have this story of obscure childhood and youth. Niâzov's family as a cornerstone of personality cult is something which many researchers pick up on, and they discuss that, saying that the factual evidence of what happened to Niâzov's family is very scanty, is very little. We know about the historical figures of his father and his mother and brothers. So instead we have a very strongly reworked story of Niâzov's childhood, his life with cruel relatives, and his sort of reliance on the spirit and the kindness of his mother and father. So a heroic father, heroic mother, but then kind of obscure personal details as well. So that's an important thing. So, but Niâzov, of course, was a kind of a very integral, so should I say, personality, because he was to be seen as a spiritual leader and the president, so a political leader. He was a politician, he was a scientist, he was a thinker, an architect, a farmer. So all these things in one, and all these things have to be seen as something which he excelled in. And that was a very important part of his personality cult, that he could do all these things well. And of course, the kind of epitome, the top thing was Ruhnama. Ruhnama was appeared kind of later in his career when he decided to write the moral constitution of the Turkmen people. A couple of times he said that it was not to be seen as a religious book, but then the evidence suggests that it was all, again, like he was everything in one person. So Ruhnama had to be a text which had everything in it. And Ruhnama is, of course, an interesting text in itself. So I'd like to say a couple of words about that. And my vision is that it should be seen as a text, not so much as a reflection of his personality, and some kind of interesting political and mythological sort of considerations, but as a kind of a text, which I think that could be seen as a kind of a postmodernist Gesamtkunstwerk. So the holistic work of art, the holistic work of literature, which sort of integrates everything in itself. And unfortunately, there is so much, maybe when you read texts about the Ruhnama, you can see that there is a lot of criticism on this absurd and mythologized history of Turkmen, which doesn't hold any kind of examination, any kind of test against the facts. So that kind of absurdity of Ruhnama, I think, sort of somehow veils and obscures the origin of the text, which to me is an interesting thing, because on the one hand, you can say that it sort of reveals and embodies and is the product of the kind of utopian vision of the past. So in the contemporary discourse, we talk a lot about utopias, and it is become an important part of the left-wing discourse. And I think that we can borrow that term to discuss Ruhnama. It's a utopian vision of the past. So he's rewriting the past in the way he wants to be seen, without thinking about whether it's factual or not. Some kind of references which are there to facts are used rather liberally, should I say. But then that utopian vision of the past is projected into the present and in the future, creating a kind of a timeless kind of scale, creating a sort of metaphysical unity of some kind, which is an interesting thing. And you can see here that there are some archetypes also at work here. In the first volume, I think that the key person and the key reference is Görögli, the character of the eponymous epic, Turkmen epic, Görögli. So again, the concept of the father of the nation is evident here. So Niâzov, the Turkmenbashi, he sees himself as a kind of a reincarnation of Görögli. In the second volume, there is more reference to Islam and to Prophet Muhammad, and in many ways, Niâzov, I think, sort of claims that his text is maybe kind of a further development of Islam and further development of the Quran. And if you look at the huge mosque outside Ashgabat, which is called Turkmenbashi Spirit, Turkmenbashi Ruhi, and I think what happens is that you see that the Quranic inscriptions on this mosque are interspersed with the quotations from Ruhnama, which of course is not a very Islamic thing to do. But anyway, this is one element of that. So utopian vision. Next is that kind of messianic archetype. But the text itself is a strange concoction. That's why I call it postmodernist. It's not a very sort of straightforward text. It's a concoction of different styles and genres. So you can see there some elements of his diaries and some archaeological and historical data written by someone else, perhaps, some poetry, some kind of high prose in a kind of very high-spirited texts. And that kind of combination is rather interesting. So it's not a very homogenic text at all. So I think that it would be interesting to look at that from the literary viewpoint and see what kind of influences were there at work. So what influenced Niâzov, and I think that you can find some parallels. I'm not saying that he was influenced by those texts directly, but maybe in a kind of indirect way, I find a lot of commonality with the tone of Nietzsche's Also sprach Zarathustra, when Niâzov writes about what he wants his people to understand, some kind of moral judgments which he makes about the life in the society. But then also, interestingly, his diaries do resemble Mein Kampf. So he writes about how he struggled and suffered in Leningrad and in his youth, seeing that the life of Turkmen, the huge history of the Turkmen nation has been sort of in a constant decay for the last 300 years. So, and that does resemble Hitler's laments of the Germanic decline, in which he apparently experienced and saw in Vienna. So you can see that those interesting parallels. Again, it would be interesting to see whether there was a direct influence of Mein Kampf or not, but the archetype is evidently there. So, and then you've got obviously Görgli, the epic, some Persian poetry, I think, is important, but then some Soviet historical archaeological texts. So again, the Soviet legacy had a very strong impact on Niâzov's texts. So in a way, he wanted to also sound and look academic. He wanted to legitimize himself not only as a kind of a religious and messianic figure, but also as an historian, as a scientist of some kind. And then basically going back to this commonalities between those writers, we can say here that there's authoritarian modernity, which is evident in all these three cases. They have something in common, but they also have some differences. So as the researcher Miki Bulman writes in 2011, all 5 Central Asian republics developed strong presidential systems, and everywhere the heads of state were actively involved in the creation and propagation of the new state ideology, also through the writing of books on politics and the histories of their respective republics. So that is obviously common all over Central Asia, to less extent in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, but then at the same time, I think that they represent very different types of writer. So Rashidov and Karimov and Niâzov were very different, and that was also the type of the author, the way they saw themselves. And then also the texts they wrote were very different, and the relationship between the writer and the text were different. So that's something which I think is interesting, but also interesting in the sense that none of those kind of writings, none of those attempts to kind of enter the annals of history worked that well, probably better, paradoxically, with the Song of Kashmir, because it still sort of it continues to live, while the writings of Karimov and Niâzov, I don't think that they are still as important as they were when the writers were alive. So none of this has quite worked. And my question is like, why? So what might be the reason for that decline? Is it just because those texts were bad and just bad, or maybe there are some other reasons? For example, can we say that the time of grand narratives of that kind of modernity is over? Whether you can say that the whole concept of enlightened despot is no longer relevant. So yeah, and in this sense, I would like to just maybe show some of the last diagrams, which I kind of sketched just to show the difference between, I think, the structural differences between those texts. So when we have the Song of Kashmir is basically it's one little text fairy tale which it gets reincarnated all the way down to sort of films made in India many years later. But sort of you can have here anti-colonial narrative, which was something which fed and inspired Dinanath Nadim. So he wrote the opera of Bambur Tayambarzal, and then that kind of was rewritten and reworked by Rashidov in his version of the Song of Kashmir. And then you have different kind of spin-offs, the cartoon, the film, the ballet, and then it kind of feeds back into India, feeds back into kind of non-alignment movement. You can say that there is at least there are several texts about the importance of the importance of Rashidov for the Soviet-Indian relationship. So that's this interesting process of reincarnating, reworking, and remaking the same kind of rather simple narratives. With Islam Karimov, I think the whole story is very different. So I would call it the story of the core and the context. So you have texts, numerous texts, about 20 or something texts, which are formed in a more or less the same way. They contain, let's say, similar issues. Well, this is just an example. I'm not trying to sort of say that that is an exhaustive way of looking at Karimov's writing, but just to give you an example, so you have things like the criticism of the USSR, and you've got that element of the glorious past, Tamerlane and the heritage of Uzbek nation, and you have some kind of topical issues of today. You have absolutely necessary talks about our bright future, about the enemies who kind of stay on the way. And then you've got text which kind of contain all these elements to this or that extent. Some of them are more metaphysical, so less dedicated to current issues. Some are kind of more topical, some are more of today, but then the core remains the same. So contexts are different. So there's details he was talking about were relevant only for a couple of years, and then they lost their relevance. So you've got texts sometimes which resemble each other. So and that goes on and on and on. That sort of hitting the same sort of ground with lots of different details which become irrelevant later on. And that is, I think, the kind of the picture which emerges from Karimov's texts. And when he died, not only those details disappeared, but also maybe his vision also was no longer relevant. And therefore, well, we don't have that much of a Karimov's readings these days as there were 5 years ago. And Niâzov, of course, with his uninhibited imagination is a very different story. So I think that his writings are much more postmodernist in let's say, in the character, and it's an attempt to bring in everything together. So there are some core narratives, like talking about Turkmen people, talking about some kind of glory of the past, talking about family and difficulties, but then there are little details which can be used here and there. They support some of his arguments, they support some of his conclusions, but in the end is sort of a big hybrid piece of work in 2 volumes, which contains everything and at once, but then it sort of can be seen as a embodiment and personalization in the text of Niâzov himself. So his writing had to be kind of the cornerstone of the new Turkmenistan. But then as soon as he had gone himself, he died in 2006, the relevance of Ruhnama for the Turkmen became quite clearly less so than when he was alive. So the book basically was rightly seen as hollow, as full of sort of falsifications of history and so on. So that is something which I think is important to keep in mind. And with this, I would like to leave you with not so much with the answers, but with different kinds of questions, which I think can be interesting things to follow up and to consider. Like, for example, whether it is just because the time of grand narratives is really over. So we've got that situation when grand nations are no longer talked about, and then, of course, the kind of relatively unsuccessful bid of Donald Trump to make America great again, I think, is a good illustration of that. But also maybe there is no need for any kind of definitive books any longer. When you have Twitter, you've got Instagram, you've got Facebook, TikTok, and all those social networks have replaced the book, and the book as the source of wisdom and knowledge and stuff like that. Maybe there's a big question whether a great leader needs grand personal text, or maybe not. It's an interesting question, because in the previously probably it was seen as a sign of this greatness that the leader needs that. Maybe this time is the time of doers, people who rather act and change the world rather than write about that. Maybe also we have this diminished interest in the great leaders in general. If you think about the whole post-modernity, and you know that Putin's Russia is often seen as a kind of postmodern state, with such characters as Surkov. Obviously, he was an influential figure in the past, and with creating different kind of interesting paradigms, and but maybe that kind of postmodernity and things like Trump's post-truth, they have rendered the whole modernist agenda of an enlightened despot obsolete. So, and but then on the other hand, maybe this meta-modernist revival, which is we're experiencing these days, can help the concept of enlightened despot survive and remain in kind of relevant, or maybe modified. But so all these sort of questions I think are interesting, and maybe give some food for thought. So, and with that, I kind of would like to finish my presentation. So thank you very much for that, for staying with me. And if you've got any questions, so please ask them. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexei. It was very interesting. And as you said at the end, maybe we got a lot of questions now with your presentation. And that's maybe one of the things which is very interesting. Of course, the subject was we get in kind of word of these three figures, these three leaders from Central Asia, and we get a kind of view that we are not used to, which is, as you said, not so political, and with a little part of their activities. And we can give another view of what is the position of this leader figure in the political scene of Central Asia. And there is, of course, now a lot of questions, which could get from the 50s until nowadays, and with all this process we are going on. So maybe I would just, before, if any, of course, if any of the participants want to ask any questions, please, you can write it, and I can read your question, or you can by yourself ask Alexei your question. I just want to begin with some few questions. Maybe with the end of your presentation, your kind of conclusion. You were talking about kind of change, and that now the leaders don't write so much books, and in a sense we can see the same thing in other parts of the world. And you say about Putin and Trump, and maybe I will talk a little bit about France in this sense, because we got a kind of huge tradition of politicians who wrote books, and on the other end about writers, poets who were also very active political figures. And if we see for the last decades, also with the best known like De Gaulle or François Mitterrand, and there's a lot of who were really involved in literature. And we got the opposite with, for example, Nicolas Sarkozy, who just rejects a kind of literature and a kind of the way to speak well in French, and so also all these elements who were rejecting literature, and the fact to have to write real books or with literature. Of course, politicians still publish books, but it's more for political reason. And at the moment of campaign, or when they want to become president, or can like this. And the other thing I wanted to say about this, it's maybe in the case of Central Asia, maybe you were talking about epics, and also here we got the oral narratives, and maybe in a sense nowadays we get back to this kind of tradition with maybe and this could be in a sense the example of Nazarbayev, who didn't wrote so many books, and anyway his books are not put in front as it was for Turkmenbashi or for Karimov. But we got a lot of narrative. We could be oral narrative, or we could be film on Nazarbayev about his life, and maybe you could have something about that, about what do you think about this change and with this different figure, which are not the one you were talking about. And also what I was thinking about Rashidov and the difference between Rashidov and Turkmenbashi and Karimov, because he was at the first a writer, then he became a politician. And with the other, they were politicians who wrote books. And in a sense, kind of writer or poet or philosopher or whatever we can tell they were. And here's the question about the time when the book is published. It's before political scene, at the moment, or after. Of course, here with Central Asian leaders, usually after there is no more, because they are dead when they are still in place. But maybe with the case of Rashidov, in a sense, is quite interesting also, because with his books were written before he became first secretary of Communist Party, and what was their life during the Soviet period also. So maybe what after I could have maybe other questions. So if anybody has a question to ask, please do. Alexei?
Yeah, so let me just see whether I can answer those things. Because one thing to me is obvious that we can't really take these figures as a kind of singular examples of author's I, author's self, because people generally, of course, get formed during many years. So the things which Rashidov and Karimov and Niâzov received during their formative years, of course, influenced them a lot. And then when they became writers, when they felt that they had to write, because there were some different reasons for that. Now, and then because they lived into kind of, Rashidov lived in the 80s, so before the postmodernity came, and then, but both to Central Asia, let's say, to Soviet Union. So he didn't really struggle with that. But I think that both Karimov and Niâzov in particular, I think they had to consider the way their writings, their kind of legacy can be seen and interpreted in the current context. And to me, Karimov, of course, was probably less concerned about seeing his text as formative. So my impression with this, that he was really influenced by the Soviet Union, by this idea of primary sources. So, but then again, they were always interpreted in Uzbekistan as if they never came from him personally. So Karimov never really ordered, or at least we never saw that happening openly, that he never really wanted his works to be published and taught and quoted. So it was done by the admiring people, admiring kind of leaders of a lesser scale. So I think that with Karimov, it's a difficult story in this sense, because we don't really have much of a reflection. We don't have his reflection. He was talking, and then grateful followers published those texts, and then they found them so profound that they developed a whole curriculum around this. With Niâzov, I think that his desire was much more clear. that he actually wanted people to accept his text as a formative. And should also remember that Ruhnama appeared while Karimov, he started talking about Uzbekistan and his developing his ideas of Uzbek identity. So very early on, so in a couple of months, even, and years after he became the president. While Niâzov, of course, and as many researchers underline, that he decided to write his Ruhnama closer to the end of the 90s, and maybe as a response to sort of some decline in the idea of Turkmenistan as a great nation. So his intention could have been a desire to somehow remedy the situation, to bring together all those ideas. And then he was operating in a very different environment. So he was aware, perhaps, of those threats. And apparently, while Karimov was operating in a real life situation with his text being spin-offs of what he was doing in real life. For Niâzov, that the story was very different. And he was digging into the past to project his vision of the past into the present. So, and it was not related very much to what was happening in Turkmenistan at the time. So in a way, that poses an interesting question, because that position of the role of postmodernity is particularly interesting, whether we are experiencing as a sense, in a way, of decline of postmodernity itself, because I would also argue that we need to differentiate between postmodernism as a style, which is obviously seen as sort of having passed its prime, but then postmodernity is a condition of this kind of high and dense cultural hybridity. I don't think this is quite over. So here I find it quite difficult yet to say whether that grand narratives of the past have completely gone, and now we've got that the situation which is characterized by people like Putin and Nicolas Sarkozy, and even Nazarbayev, who doesn't want to create kind of religious text and who writes more in a kind of less prophetic and less messianic way. But I'm not sure. I can't be sure, because there is also evidence that metamodernism is coming back. So the Surkov is gone. So that kind of play with the narratives is gone, and then there may be a new revival of the very modernist and holistic approach to things. I don't know. That's difficult to say, especially taking into consideration that in many ways Central Asia has to deal with its own specific features, and then which can be seen as a bit late on the world scene. So I think that in the future we'll see what is happening. But at the moment, for example, with the current president of Uzbekistan, we don't have that, although many parts of the personality cult are there, but he's not writing, he's not seen as a kind of religious figure of that. He's just a technocrat who's trying to remedy the situation in Uzbekistan. That's what the kind of the narrative is, but not a great leader in the sense Karimov was trying to portray himself. So it's difficult to say. So can you switch on the microphone, please?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so thank you. If anybody has questions, so you can write on the chat, or you can take your word. But I will just go on if there is for the moment no other question. Maybe also the kind of thing which could be a little bit like the same between events through times from Rashidov in the 50s and Karimov and Niâzov in the 90s. That it was a period when, in a sense, the leader have to reinvent or invent a kind of statehood or identity. If you say in the 50s, that's one of the idea of also of this this webinar. That in the 50s we get in a new process in the Soviet Union, especially in Central Asia, when there is all these persons who get to universities and were trying after the Second World War, after the repression, after the Stalinism, trying to build a Soviet Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and so on, and to see what would be the basis for it. And in the 90s, it was after the independence, and so still the leaders have also to reinvent what will be the new independence after the Soviet Union, and what will be the basis for it. And so maybe it's also one of the elements which has pushed Niâzov and Karimov to this kind of writings. And maybe nowadays, if you say in Uzbekistan or in Turkmenistan, the new president that don't have to reinvent, because it's already there in a sense. You say about the Uzbek model of Karimov, who is still, even if it's changing a little bit, but it's still here. And in Turkmenistan, that's maybe we got the same. And so maybe that's a kind of a bit of questions. What do you think about that?
Well, I agree. I agree that, of course, the situation was very different. And I think that also we have to look into more detail in the way how Rashidov, for example, was influenced by Brezhnev. Mm-hmm. Because Brezhnev, of course, also wrote books, and his The Little Land, his memoirs from the Second World War, and then a book about the I think it's Celina. It was also quite interesting to follow. Again, there's a big dispute whether they were all written by by themselves or not. But I think that in the case of Rashidov, of course, because he was not the head of the Soviet Union, right? So he was one of the leaders of the Soviet republics. Because his mission was obviously already defined, as you said, that to basically work within the paradigm of the Soviet system, to support it and to gain as much as possible from that sort of system, but not contradicting it, not doing anything particularly messianic. And because he had already been a writer, he became the first secretary of Uzbekistan. His writing habits and his style had already been defined, and I don't think that, well, at least as far as I understand, his writing didn't really change much in terms of its focus, right? With Turkmenistan, the situation, of course, is very different, because after Turkmenbashi died, his descendant, the new president, is also a prolific writer. Maybe in many ways, he's trying to outdo Niâzov, but with Niâzov was more of a kind of a sedentary and aged patriarch. And the new president has been positioning himself as a horse rider, as a singer, as a guitar player. So and he's got his many little books. But well, Niâzov had only one book, which was the central book of his life. Well, the current president has got lots of different books on different subjects. So in a way, there's a newer incarnation of that. But to be honest, I'm not very familiar with those. So with Ruhnama and the situation, I am familiar because I visited Turkmenistan many times. I read Ruhnama and I have got an opinion about that. As for Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov's writings, it's difficult to access it in Uzbekistan. I haven't seen it anywhere. But then also it will be interesting to see how it works. I think that basically, to me, Ruhnama is not that old yet to be seen as a monument of literature. I'm sure it will be sometime later, and it will attract some attention as a document of its time. Now, of course, assessed on its literary merits, it doesn't attract much attention. Well, yes, and I think that the situation with Karimov again is also different. Yeah, so no, it's it's very complex. It's more complex than it actually, I think, looks from the outside, and maybe it deserves more attention. And in particular, as I'm trying to say, that these texts should not be seen as only responses to a certain political situation, but I think they should be seen as texts as such. So maybe they require some kind of textual analysis as well, not just political historical.
And do you think it's possible to, because you already just mentioned maybe some influences, but of course there is not so many sources about to know what was but do we have some kind of information about what they were reading, what kind of books, or what kind of element? If there is some mention about from the Karimov or Turkmenbashi or even Rashidov, what they were reading at that time.
I didn't find much about that. And again, one thing you should remember when you have those formative years of life, when you read a lot and that reading influences you, then there is more kind of indirect evidence than direct. Obviously, you can say that neither, for example, Turkmenbashi couldn't have read Nietzsche or Mein Kampf when he was young. That is out of question. It was not available in the Soviet Union. And they, as simple Central Asian chaps from kind of village, from sort of rather poor background, they didn't read much in terms of, well, they didn't come from very educated families, but so the kind of staple diet of the Soviet literature, I think that what they had to read at school, what they had to read in the university, Lenin's works, Marx's works, Gorky, Chekhov, and I think that that would be it. So, but when you have that, and then again, we should also keep in mind that their biographies are heavily tweaked. And that whenever you read about them, you have this obscurity of childhood. You've got lots of biographical data which don't look exactly right. And but at least I haven't. Turkmenbashi actually says that he was reading some kind of classical literature, Russian classical literature, when he was studying in Leningrad, and I think he also mentions that he was unhappy about the fact that there was not much in terms of Turkmen literature, but I think these are kind of very kind of indirect evidences of those influences. I think that what could have helped also is not so much seeing whether there was a direct influence, for example, of Nietzsche on Turkmenbashi, but whether there are certain archetypes which worked, right? Which worked, and why a certain kind of well, as I said, I find some similarity between those laments Turkmenbashi has about his life in Russia and Mein Kampf stories about Hitler being unhappy in Vienna. So I don't think that Turkmenbashi actually imitated Mein Kampf. That would be probably bringing it a bit too far. But to see why that sort of thing happens, how it works, and how it moves a person to think and produce text in a certain way, that would be interesting. Maybe reconstructing some kind of archetypes on a textual level.
And also, you were talking about people who are helping them writing. And do you have any information about them, about who they were, about how do they help them in these books, to write these books?
Not really, and there's on the one hand you've got this tradition of literary slaves, so we have that, and it's more. I think it's better researched in the context of the Soviet Union and Brezhnev, and well, that's kind of part of the world. We don't have anyone who's come up and said, "Okay, I wrote Ruhnama." We have only rumors, which have, for example, there are some rumors who connect the whole chapter in Ruhnama about the history of Turkmen and the invention of the wheel with the name of Victor Sarianidi, the famous architect, the famous archaeologist who worked in Turkmenistan. And the rumors again have it that to buy himself an opportunity to continue to work, Sarianidi wrote that. But again, I mean, it will be probably interesting to have a look at, compare Sarianidi's own writing, which he kind of authored, and he signed himself with that sort of text to see whether it is true. But I think that the fact that there's kind of an anonymity of those writers and that persisting rumors that there is someone else who's writing it for them. And of course, with Karimov's case, obviously you've got speechwriters. I don't know who speechwriters for Karimov were, but then it's not a secret that obviously speeches are written by someone and then reinterpreted and delivered. So there's a kind of collective authorship which exists there in different forms. But I think that with the case of Rashidov, at least we may say that he didn't use those literary slaves until much later. So maybe his later novels were written in a cooperation with someone, but that translation, that sort of the Song of Kashmir is definitely his own work.
And to go back to this, the Song of Kashmir, it's also quite interesting in a sense about anti-colonial movement and also with the cooperation who starts at that moment between Soviet Union and other part of the world were colonized or in a movement of decolonization. And did Rashidov take part in all this, because there was some kind of also conferences and meetings in Tashkent from writers from other parts of the world who came to Tashkent in the 50s, 60s. So was he involved in this after he wrote this book which talked about this and about the links between India and Central Asia? So maybe did he go on with this idea?
I think so. And as I said, that Uzbekistan had been seen as a success story of the Soviet Union for a long time before Rashidov. But at least I'm not a historian of Uzbekistan so much that I can't really tell you exactly whether there was a strong link between, let's say, the personalities who were at the head of the republic in the 30s and 40s. But probably not. But judging by what was going on, you could see that there was more in the 30s and 40s. Of course, was much more sort of let's say everything was dependent on Stalin and his power. So there was not a lot of space for individuals from, let's say, republics to maneuver. And I think what happens here is that after Stalin's death, there's desire to open the Soviet Union up to countries of non-alignment, to Asia and Africa. Those things required someone, and Rashidov probably was seen as a very good and well-formed figure. So he was invited to be there, and he was, so in 1955, he was, 37, right? He was born in 1917, so in 1957 he would have been 40. He was quite young at the time, but already quite prominent. So he was invited to do that, but he was still young to perform those kind of duties for the Soviet Union. But then I think that maybe to actually worked for the Soviet Union, and Tashkent later became the kind of key kind of scene, the key city to hold all those international festivals of friendship, the cinema festival, the literary festivals, so theater, music, and so there was a lot of work on that. And I think that Uzbekistan in particular was an exemplary country. with that kind of Muslim association. And I think that Rashidov himself actually was sent on many diplomatic missions to different countries to actually give talks. So he was not just the head of the Soviet Uzbekistan. He was very much an ambassador.
Mm-hmm.
So he performed many diplomatic missions abroad, and probably talked about that, showed how he worked. So that kind of, again, the need to convince was there, but in a very different way to, let's say, Karimov or Turkmenbashi, who were self-centered and who were self-appointed messiahs of new countries. Rashidov had a very different function to perform.
Yeah, of course, the Soviet Union, as a republic of the Soviet Union, of course, it couldn't be as dependent as was Karimov and Turkmenbashi. And that question is because if you see, it's as I worked on about this leader from the East, from Kazakhstan, from Tatarstan, and so on in the 20s, and we were struggling against colonialism, and as well, I was very surprised that they didn't have any contact with anti-colonial movement outside the Soviet Union. And at the time, a few years ago, I was at a conference in Singapore about the influence of the Russian Revolution in the East, in Asia. And all the different researchers who were coming from Asia, they didn't have any idea about what was going on inside the Soviet Union, about the national questions, about Sultan Galiev and all this question about how to put together Islam and revolution. And as themselves, they were working about this question in Indonesia, for example, or in India, but they didn't have any idea of what was going on in Soviet Union. And also at that time, when you see Comintern, there is no representative from Central Asia who worked in Comintern to put the revolution outside. And if we see here with Rashidov, what's quite interesting that he is in this delegation, and there is kind of a new view about Central Asia that was not before, and and that's it goes and it went, of course, a bit like about through Islam, because there was also trying to make contact with movement in the Islamic world, but also through and more through literature and art, and that's very interesting. And if we look also from the writers and the artists from Central Asia, they were really influenced by this meeting we're taking in Tachkent or in other parts of the world with these writers and artists who came from other parts of the world. So that's kind of very interesting moments.
Yeah, I think it's just maybe there's a lot of gaps, lots of different gaps in information, because obviously in the 30s, for example, there was a strong connection between Uzbekistan and, for example, anti-colonial sentiment in the States. So Americans who came to the Soviet Union to work, and the engineers, they had some African Americans as well, and so the African Americans visited Uzbekistan and sort of saw that the situation in the Soviet Union is very different to what was still kind of segregation and in the States. So, but then to which extent that's kind of those stories traveled and whether they influenced anything is difficult. Now I'm kind of working on one little project which explores fairly recent event of an African-American music conductor working in Uzbekistan about 20 years ago. And then again, it's very difficult to find anything about that. So she visited, she worked with some composers and ballet dancers, and I think they staged Porgy and Bess in our Hawaii theater, but then it's very difficult to find any information. But from people who just remember that, and a couple of photos taken from that. So I think that what could have been a much more active and profound influence and interconnection between different things at the time, those things gradually got lost. Or, for example, if you think about the 30s, when the Soviet Union was again planning an invasion of British India, right? I think that it had a very strong intelligence base in Samarkand and Tachkent. So, and then now you can't find any information about that. So,
yeah, of course, I think also that's maybe, especially when we talk about art, it could be one representation and it could change your life. So it just could be one thing that you don't have any information, there is no sources about it, and who had so many influence on of people and change a lot of things. I don't know if there is no questions from participants, so maybe we'll stop at that moment. I will just remember that next session will be on the 17th of May, on Monday at the same time. And we are talking about Tashkent, kind of the center of art and of literature, music, theater. And it will be a presentation by Lucy Lissac, who worked a few years on it's her PhD dissertation, and it's a publication by IFEAC, by our institute, from last year, about Ilkhom and the Festival of Contemporary Music in Tashkent. We came from, I think, the 1970s until nowadays. So it's will be the presentation of her book and a discussion about all this question about in Tashkent, contemporary art, contemporary music, theater. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexei. It was a real pleasure to hear you and to listen to your presentation. And so I hope everybody was happy to be at this first seminar, and hope to see you next time for in a month about. Thank you very much.
So take care.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that for the people who are registered today, we will send the link straight away. Bye-bye.
Bye. Cheers.
Bye. Thank you.